It's really good to be here today on International Day of Disaster Risk Reduction. Thank you very much for that glowing introduction. And I'm going to use the opportunity of this keynote today to talk about a recent trip that I've taken to South Asia. I finally managed to get to visit South Asia during the monsoon, and I'm going to share some of the experiences from our projects in Nepal in particular from that recent visit. But also, as David was introducing me, this diagram I drew as a result of sitting in a meeting back in about 2013. It was one of the initial kick-off meetings of a global alliance of which Practical Action is a partner, the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance. And it was really trying to capture that dynamism between being prepared for multiple hazards while at the same time trying to invest in development. And I think a lot of the examples that I'm going to give today relate to that paradigm. So I've been asked to talk about resilience, and I think 10 years ago I thought resilience was a really good idea. But I think there are some problems with resilience, and I think one of the fundamental challenges with resilience is it means different things to different people. It's a very, very appealing concept. If you say you're going to build the resilience of something, there are very few people who would say that's a bad idea. But the problem is when you engage in discussions about what resilience means, it means different things to different people. It's focusing on different threats, it's focusing on different outcomes, and also timescales, targets are all different. And therefore, I was party to a paper with colleagues from Exeter University, which really sort of tried to challenge. Maybe the problem with resilience is aiming for resilience. We're getting suboptimal outcomes, and maybe there are other things that we could aim for which would deliver resilience benefits, which is something I'll come back to later in the talk. But first of all, as I said, Practical Action is part of the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance. And we've been working on flood resilience around the world since about 2009, and as part of the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance since 2013. We're working in Nepal and Bangladesh in South Asia. We've also been working in Peru and Bolivia for about 7 or 8 years. We've recently rolled the program out into Africa, and we're interested in looking at flooding in urban environments in Senegal and in rural environments in Zimbabwe, trying to take some of the lessons from our programs in the Andes and the Himalayas to a very different context, that is Africa. Why floods? Globally significant hazard. Climate change is making them worse. The World Bank in a recent report estimated that 23% of the global population is at flood risk. The economic losses are huge, but we also know some things that we can do about them. And I think that's why very much floods was the focus of this alliance about building resilience. So I'm going to focus most of my talk on our project in Nepal. And it's a good project because there are some nice strong overlaps with the Institute of Hazard Risk and Resilience, the work of one of your former PhD students on insurance, but also the work of Sim and some of your students on what we can do about mapping flood risk. But we've been working in the west of Nepal since 2013. We're working in the Karnali River Basin, and the Karnali River Basin is actually this huge area here that flows out in a smaller area here. But the river actually originates in Tibet. So it's one of those perennial, long-standing rivers that was there before the Himalayas rose. You've got the high mountain areas, you've got the mid-hills, and then you've got this highly productive plains area called the Tarai. And this is where this project operates. It operates where that river that flows out of the mountains passes through a gorge and then splits into this delta. And this delta has, for many centuries, been a very productive environment. There's plenty of water, the floods bring silt. It's a highly productive environment, but it's also a high-risk environment. Floods happen regularly. So we've been working in this area, as I said, since about 2010. And this is the landscape. So it's rural communities, it's very much agricultural based, highly productive, but of course they face floods on a regular basis. Rice is one of the most important crops, and of course that's grown during the monsoon. It's all paddy rice, and it's primarily for consumption and some for markets. They also grow sugarcane, tobacco. These fields outside of the monsoon season will have lentils and vegetables. So it's a highly productive landscape. About 3 agricultural commodities per year on a unit of land. They also supplement their diets with the wetland resources. This is a lady fishing in one of the streams, collecting shrimp and collecting small fish. So they're highly utilise the wetland resources for supplemental nutrition. They also have extensive areas of community forest. Most of it, sadly, is in this sort of state. It's been planted with non-native species here. This is for a fuel woodlot for a village, but there are some patches of natural forest that have been protected. And if I go back to the original map, apologies, the upper area of the watershed on this side is Bardia National Park, extensive area of forests and part of the tiger corridor that stretches across the west of Nepal. So there is plenty of natural forest in the landscape, but there are also these community forests that are used for wood, and they're also used for medicinal plants, and very importantly, they're used for fodder for cattle. So they have livestock, they have buffalo, goats, and cattle, and a recent judgment by India to stop importing cows from Nepal means that Nepal's roads are now blocked by large herds of female cows with male calves or cows that are no longer producing milk. So the productive cows are being kept on the homesteads, and the cows that are no longer productive have been released into the environment. And they literally occupy the roads. This is the East-West Highway, the Mahindra Highway, and this is just one of many large herds of cows that congregate on the roads late in the evening, stay on the roads during the night, and then disperse during the day to graze on the roadside verges, and then collect again. Massive road hazard, but of course, if you kill a cow in Nepal, it's the same as killing a person. So they literally cause traffic jams on this main highway. So that's the people that we've been working with. And one of the things that when we started working with them, when we started talking about, well, what can we do to build their resilience? One of the first things they think about, well, is preventing the floods happen or preventing the water causing the problem. And this is an example of a raised livestock shelter. So they've got goats in this platformed area. It's designed to be above where the floodwaters are, primarily to prevent the animals getting disease. Because as the villagers who lived here said, well, the animals are walking around in the water, they're getting wet, and they're bringing hoof rot and other diseases into the other animals at night. So if we can keep them out of the way of the water during the flood season, then they'll be healthier. We won't have to worry about the health consequences. But it's not just these small-scale measures. Communities are also collectively working to manually produce these gabions and then locate these gabions alongside the river in areas where they see flood risk as a real problem. This isn't actually in the Kanali River, but this is in the Mahakali, and it's the biggest community implemented gabion scheme that I've seen. This is slightly further west than where Practical Action is working. This is a Mercy Corps project that I was visiting. But this community had actually manually installed these gabions all the way along this basin. And they're primarily protecting their agricultural fields, which are here, and then their agricultural fields that are higher up on that platform there. And then the village is about 50 metres further on that side of the river. But of course, one of the consequences of this protection on this side of the river is it's accelerating erosion on the opposite bank. And this is, I think, a very dynamic landscape. protection of river in one point leads to erosion at other points. Sedimentation, erosion really does transform this landscape on a year-by-year basis. Of course, the Karnali River is a critically important river for the government of Nepal. So the government of Nepal has rolled out the Karnali River Management Programme. It started in 2013, and they have done extensive embankments in the river, primarily on the outer edges of the river. So the delta as it splits into the two branches, the Karnali and the Garuwa, there are areas which have got extensive protection such as this. However, they've implemented about 70 kilometres of protection, which is about less than about 5% of the entire river basin area. So what they've been able to protect is a small proportion of the areas that they probably ultimately would need to protect to provide an effective flood mitigation measure. But of course, they've focused on critical areas where urban centres are close to rivers or highly productive agricultural areas are close to rivers. But of course, that resilience that they provide doesn't always play out as resilience to the communities. And this is a community that just happened to be in the wrong place when the implementation of the barrier was put in. This house has now been moved, or this shelter has now been moved. The community has moved further away from the barrier. They've now put steps in to the embankment to allow people to access to the river. Because one of the other consequences of these protection schemes, these embankments, is these communities still rely on the river for their water supply. They still rely on the river for their washing their clothes. And the women in this community particularly were really challenged by, we asked for protection, but we've now got a barrier to the river. We're having to carry the water over this barrier. We're having to carry our clothes over the river to wash them. So, as I said at the beginning, resilience to our reactions to build resilience in some ways can lead to challenges and problems in other ways. But there are different ways to going about building barriers. There's the engineering approach and there's the more traditional approach. And this is something that Practical Action and several other NGOs in Nepal have been piloting. And they're called biodikes. And the idea is that you use locally available resources, plenty of rice cultivation, plenty of rice fertilizer used, lots of fertilizer bags, lots of bamboo in the landscape. And they use bamboo piles, fertilizer bags filled with soil to build structures which they then cover with soil. And so this is the biodike during construction. And this is the same biodike 3 years later. And I visited this biodike on my recent trip, and there are now trees growing along this section. So it's utilised, and you can see the old piles that are there to hold the sandbags in place, and these plant roots have now penetrated between the bags to create almost a living structure. And talking to the community members, they see this as a really valuable way of protecting the riverbanks, because that's a great fodder resource for their livestock. That's a great place to come and plant fruit trees and bamboo for resources for the community. They can plant rattan there. This is actually an area that's opposite the national park, and they get wild animal incursions coming from that area as well. So again, and I was a little sceptical when I heard this, but they said if we can plant the plants close enough together, it'll stop the animals coming out of the river at that point, and they'll come out of the river further down where our crops aren't. I'm not convinced that that's true, but that's what they've done with this biodike. And there are two things. Because they're utilising it, they're monitoring the biodike on a regular basis. So if an area is subject to erosion, they can actually do something about it. And then the other thing that they mentioned is when erosion does occur during the flood season, when the river then declines, the plants tend to grow into the areas. They fill the cracks. They collect sediment. So it's a more adaptive structure than a hard concrete measure. So the project has been implementing various types of mitigation measures. These biodikes seem to offer potential, and an achievement of practical action and my colleagues in Nepal was when the government introduced the budget in 2020, they had a budget for flood mitigation measures, and Nepal is a country that faces floods extensively in that Terai area. 2/3 of the population live in that area. And in their flood mitigation budget, they gave the amount that they were releasing to local governments to implement flood mitigation measures, and they said, and we would advise using natural resource-based methods such as biodikes, because it's cost-effective, doesn't require external technical assistance, and is something communities can get on and do themselves. So another thing that practical action has been working on for many decades is early warning systems, and that's the topic of the International Day of Disaster Risk Reduction this year. And practical action has been working on early warning systems for many years and very much focused on making sure that early warning systems deliver messages to the people who need those messages and understand what they need to do about the impending threat. This is the the early warning system that, as articulated by practical action, and it's built around the traditional risk knowledge, risk capability, dissemination, communication, monitoring and warning, but then it brings in around the outside the elements that make it effective for communities who need the information. So involvement of the local community is paramount. If ensuring that there are effective governance systems so that if the system isn't working, it is adjusted. Taking a monitoring of single hazards, but taking it to a multi-hazard approach. So we know we have an early warning system for floods. It tells us certain things. How can we apply some of the commonalities to other risks that these communities face? For example, landslides. And most importantly, and this is a precept, I think, of an effective resilience approach, is building resilience from the weakest links. So making sure that gender perspectives and other barriers to access are considered in the design of the early warning system. And in many of the communities in Nepal, they have maps, they have hazard maps, and they indicate where disabled people are, where the elderly people are, where pregnant mothers or lactating mothers are, so that the response team knows which houses to go to make sure people have got to the shelters. So it's a fundamental aspect of an effective early warning system, is making sure that those warnings are actionable by the community that the early warning system is delivering for. So this is where the Karnali River flows out of the mid-hills just before it bifurcates into the delta, the lowland delta. This is the Chaisapani Gorge. And in the 1960s, when India was very interested in understanding how much water resource was coming out of the Himalayas so that they could design their agricultural programs, they built a number of monitoring stations to monitor the river flows. And this was one of the places where that was chosen. And there's literally a set of meter bars to indicate the water rising up and lowering at this point. And when Practical Action started working on early warning systems, we realised, well, this was actually a really good place to set up a river monitoring station. And initially it was a bubbler in the bottom of the river, and now it's a LiDAR sensor on an arm over the river, monitoring the height of the river. This station has been there since the 1970s. This is Parvati Gurung, who is the gauge reader, and she's been there for decades. But this has become fundamental to this early warning system, and it's the link between the national monitoring system of the Department of Hydrology and Meteorology and the local community system that connects through primarily this pivot point, Parvati Gurung. So this is an outline of Practical Action's work on early warning systems in Nepal. We started off in the 2000s with towers, watchtowers in Chitwan in the Narayan River Basin. What I've learned since going to these communities, and I know Hannah has been to some of these communities, is the primary purpose of these watchtowers was not for flood monitoring. Flood monitoring is one of the opportunities you could do with a watchtower, but you could also use a watchtower to monitor forest fire, and you could also use a watchtower to monitor wild animal incursions from the surrounding forest. So these watchtowers were built primarily as flood early warning systems, but actually for multiple hazard monitoring stations. They don't work very well with floods, because when the floods tend to happen is when it's raining heavily. When you live in a house with a corrugated roof, hearing the warning call from the top of the tower is unlikely to be heard in the middle of the night. But they do make good stations to monitor forest fire. They do make good stations to monitor wild animal incursions. But those stations really triggered the thinking about, well, how can we make the system better? How can we actually get the warning so that people hear it? They can actually respond. How can we increase the lead time? So we shifted from towers, and this was when we started working in the Canali River Basin. We realised that Chaisapani Gorge was a great place to put in a sensor in the river to monitor the river flow. So we piloted the sensor. We then worked with a local IT company to develop some technology that would link the sensor to the internet. And this was before we'd got agreement with the Department of Hydrology and Meteorology to link it to their national system. But that then started generating data on the river flows. It then got linked into the Department of Hydrology and Meteorology system, and then the Department of Hydrology and Meteorology realised that they could monitor the rivers in the country using these remote sensors. Problem with a bubbler sensor is it's located in the river, so when a flood event occurs, it tends to rip the sensor out of the riverbed and you lose the data. So that's this more recent innovation, the LiDAR sensors on the booms over the river. They can monitor the river height regardless, well, unless the water, of course, exceeds the height of the arm. But they also, using low-cost sensors, you can put them in more places. So they're not quite as accurate as the expensive, though the expensive sensors are about $10,000 a piece. You can buy cheaper sensors between $500 to $1,000. But they're not quite as accurate, but if you put enough of them out there, you can provide more coverage. And one of the aspects about this landscape is a flood can occur in one river basin and not in the river next to it, and they can be kilometres apart. So trying to establish a network of monitoring stations that provides the coverage needed to provide an early warning is an essential element. And then my colleagues appeared on a television programme talking about the fact that these stations could provide SMS messaging. And there is a video on our YouTube site where a TV programme got the Minister of Communications into the interview, a bit like a political talk show. And the interviewer handed him a book and said, right, what are you going to do to deliver early warning system messages to the people of Nepal? And he wrote out, well, I'm going to provide free SMS messaging to everybody in the areas where these stations are located. And that shifted the whole game overnight, because now the early warning messages are SMS messaging to any mobile phone within range of the tower in the area where that flood has been detected. So the Department of Hydrology and Meteorology have developed these polygons around their monitoring stations covering the major river basins in Nepal. That is not job done, because that's probably protecting less than 10% of the population that needs that protection, because there are many minor tributaries, there are many minor, what they call flashy basins in Nepal, which have no monitoring stations whatsoever. So the rollout of monitoring stations is needed. And then the final piece of the puzzle is, World Bank Cruise Initiative, where they are rolling out Doppler radar stations to provide more advanced warning of rain, the monsoon rains coming into the country. Sadly, they haven't quite implemented as many radar stations as the initial project proposal outlined. But this evolution of the early warning system is a really positive story that I've taken to Peru and I've taken to Bangladesh. And there's a lot of interest in certain aspects of it by national authorities, but also communities, to get the information that they need. So this is this national station, the Chaisapani gauge station. This is my visit about 4 weeks ago. So it started out as this with a manual observer coming up and seeing where the river was, and now is the automated station. But the gauge reader lives about 100 metres down the road from the station itself. And this is one of the smaller stations that we've rolled out in one of the tributaries of the Canale River. And one of the things that we quickly learned was it's great to be able to monitor the height of the river, but it would also be great to be able to monitor other environmental parameters. So installing these systems, they upload data using SIM cards, SMS technology. We put in rain gauge stations, automated rain gauge stations nearby as well, all solar powered, so that we can monitor the rainfall levels, the temperature, and the river height. And of course, this provided us then with a set of data upon which we could think of other options. And that's where the insurance story comes in. So we'd worked with a PhD student, Eleftheria, from the Institute of Hazard Risk and Resilience, on what would an effective insurance product in this project area look like. And Eleftheria did her PhD just before COVID, fortunately, and really provided, I think, the incentive to myself and my colleagues that this was something worth exploring. The government policy was supportive of insurance. I work in the climate change negotiations. I was highly sceptical of insurance as actually being an effective measure in such high-risk, poor environments. But the research that Eleftheria did, the interest of farmers and community members in the area to explore insurance gave me the confidence to explore what we could do. And as I showed you previously, these stations gave us the monitoring of the entire environment that would enable us to be able to come up with a parametric product, an insurance product for this area. So it took us quite a long time. So Eleftheria was closing out her PhD. We'd got the idea that we needed to develop a parametric insurance product. Local communities, cooperatives, farmers were all interested in the idea. The government was offering 90% premium subsidies. So it seemed like the environment was right to test this. So we developed a project proposal. We identified partners that we needed, so Global Parametrics to do the modelling. Stone Steps, which is a Swiss company that works on administrative systems in developing countries, administrative systems that allow complex systems to be implemented effectively. And we also identified Shikar Insurance Company, which is one of the insurance companies that is interested in looking at how to expand its product portfolio and has done some work on parametric insurance in Nepal previously. So working with Global Parametrics, very much led by Global Parametrics with Shikar Insurance Company, Practical Action was able to provide the historic flood data and the historic crop production data to develop a model. And we looked at a number of different crops, but realised that probably the first place to go would be paddy rice grown during the monsoon. So we narrowed it down to a product that would protect paddy rice during the monsoon season. And quite a painful process with Global Parametrics to actually come up with the premium payments, what the cost of the product would be, what the benefits of payments would be, how high the river would need to get for payments to be triggered. But we eventually got to an agreement that the Shikar Insurance were happy with. They were going to be the local carrier of the product. Global Parametrics are the reinsurer of the whole program. But we finally got a parametric product that seemed to be worth piloting. We then had to take it to the local insurance regulatory board to get it approved. And it took us a long time to get to the agreement in terms of what the premium payments were going to be. It took us even longer to get through the local insurance board. And on my recent visit to Nepal, one of the reasons that they told me was because they hadn't had any major hazard events taking place in the previous few months, a lot of the members of the insurance board were out in the field and trying to get them all together in the room so that they could get the product in front of them and they could debate it. It took them 45 days to get the board to come together to discuss this product. That was in late July. The monsoon in theory has already started by that point, but Stone Steps and Practical Action and IHRR, the local partners, all said, well, look, let's give it, I think we gave it 15 days, see how many products we can sell and see if we can pilot this during this monsoon. So in 15 days, they sold 935 individual products through 12 different cooperatives. So that's the top end of the system, and this is the bottom end of the system. So the insurance product is distributed through cooperatives. And we're working with, at the moment, 12 cooperatives, and we can expand that to other cooperatives in the area. And I visited the cooperatives on my recent visit. And it's really one of the things that Eleftheria's research highlighted was having a trusted intermediary, but also a trusted intermediary that people work with already would be the most effective way to distribute this product. So we worked through the cooperatives. We recognised immediately there were a number of barriers to how the product would work, and one of them was a requirement that a cooperative member has to have a land holding certificate. So we worked with the cooperative and said, yes, but many of the farmers here are tenant farmers. So how can you work around that? Okay, so we can get an agreement that the owner of the land allows the tenant farmer to produce that crop, and then they can access the product. So there were a number of hurdles that we had to overcome as we started to roll out the product. But we've managed to, as I said, roll it out to 935 households in the first year. And that's without the premium subsidy from the government of Nepal. So this is without any of the premium subsidy that was promised, that we actually thought was critical to making the whole product viable. We thought it was going to be the cost effectiveness of it. But I think the communities, particularly those producers who are dependent upon the rice crop, saw the benefits of the flood product. And unfortunately, this year, there have already been 2 payouts. So the river has reached the first payout point. So the product holders have already received 10% payment on payout for losses, and it's now breached the 25% inundation mark. So they've now received 25% payouts, which actually compensates them completely for the cost of the product in the first place. So we're very hopeful that we can take the product back to the insurance board in November or December of this year and seek their approval for it no longer being a pilot, but to actually being a product that's now authorised by the insurance board. And that will then trigger the premium subsidy from the government. And then, of course, it wouldn't just be IHRR, it would be all insurance companies in Nepal would then be able to offer this product to any farmers in river basins. But as I said, the monitoring, the data, these parts of the puzzle which are essential, we don't have for many of the river basins in Nepal because we don't have the early warning, we don't have the local sensors, we don't have the rollout of the rainfall gauges, we don't have the data necessary to develop the product. So we're starting to talk to people like yourselves to say, well, we don't have the historic data, but can we model it? Is there some other approach that we could do to retrofit the historic data to come up with models that might work? This is one of the local cooperative managers, and I saw cooperatives that were very well managed, like this one, and I saw cooperatives that were literally, you're just a club, 83 members, all of the members were members of the cooperative, they were all locally known, and they called themselves a cooperative. This cooperative had several thousand members, they had 4 staff, and the interesting thing was even though this product is a product that they carry on their phone, most of the farmers in the area have some sort of smartphone, the farmers want to see it on paper. So the insurance premiums are all held on paper, photocopies, at both the cooperative and at the local insurance office. And this is my visit to this area 4 weeks ago, and this is the area last week. So sadly the photograph is taken from the opposite end, but the area where this product has been rolled out has suffered 2 floods so far this year. It's never meters of water, but it's that initial flood pulse and then the presence of the water for 2 to 3 days following. And this was the floods that I visited 4 weeks ago. So the rice crop is just about getting to the point where it's starting to produce seed, but it's still, the farmers believe that this field probably wouldn't recover, but the fields on either side probably would, those crops would be able to recover. But as a result of climate change, this area suffered its first devastating flood in October of 2021 and its second devastating flood in October 2022. So this is the situation in the area now. Much more extensive flood. But the worrying thing about this flooding is the rice is ready for harvest. This, if they could have got into the fields and collected it, they would have been able to save some of the crop. Now, if the water recedes and they're able to harvest some of it, they might be able to rescue some of the crop. But these floods happening much later in the season are much more destructive than what traditionally happened, which would be devastating floods at the beginning of the monsoon and then the risk of flooding towards the end of the monsoon. But this is particularly problematic because those seeds are likely to degrade in the environment. But of course, that insurance product doesn't cover the farmer for their house. And the problem with these soil constructions is as soon as they become damp, they collapse. So the insurance product covers that, but it doesn't cover that. So I wanted to end just on, so what does this all mean in terms of policy? What does this all mean in terms of making change happen, making positive decisions? And we work at the community level, and this is one of the communities I visited on my recent trip. They're actually talking about data that they've collected from that community about what they see as their relative strengths and weaknesses as part of the Zurich project. But we also work with local government. And this is one of the district mayors that I met on my recent visit. The opportunity to talk to them about what their development plans are. What are they aiming for the local community? What resources do they have? Where are the areas where civil society can help? Or where are the areas where the communities can provide them with information and support for their programs? But most importantly for me is this environment, the climate talks. So this is the June subsidiary body meetings in Bonn, and this is part of the Glasgow Dialogue. A talk shop to talk about financing for loss and damage. And I've always struggled to sort of understand how do we connect the work that communities, that civil society does, that researchers does at the community level with that global policy. And I think the climate debate is a good area where there are some really tangible links, because there are certain requirements that governments have committed to as a result of signing the Paris Agreement. So they have to do these nationally determined contributions, these plans of action, climate plans of action, which in a country like the UK has got to be all about mitigation. It's got to be all about how are we going from fossil fuel generated economy to a zero net carbon economy. But in a country like Nepal, yeah, they've got to think about mitigation, but they've also got to think about adaptation. They've got to think about the costs of loss and damage. So getting those national governments to integrate loss and damage into their nationally determined contributions so that they can report on the scale of losses that are taking place as a result of climate-induced disasters. They also have to provide national communications, and those national communications have to be based upon the reality of communities on the ground. And I think there's an interesting area around here where there's a bit of a disconnect in many places. In Bangladesh, they have Form Ds, which are post-disaster needs assessment forms to fill in after an event, but they don't tend to penetrate much below that point. They get down to the district, and then the district official picks up the phone and calls a couple of people and says, so what happened with the flood event this year? How many houses, how many livestock? Broad numbers. They don't go down and actually collect the data from those communities. So there's a bit of a disconnect at this point, but there is a holistic system. But of course the most important thing is whatever those nationally determined contribution targets are, they're not only influencing national policy, they're also influencing donor priorities. So on my recent trip to Bangladesh, when I visited the FCDO, the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, and asked them what they were doing to support Bangladesh, they said, well, anything that Bangladesh had signed up to at COP26. It was as simple as that. Whatever the government has signed up to at COP26, that's what we're supporting. So we have this feedback loop. So whatever they're committing to at the national level can influence what happens in the communities on the ground. And trying to strengthen and connect those together so that good global decisions lead to good practice on the ground, I think is part of the work that I do on a regular basis. Climate policy. IPCC 6th assessment report, very depressing read. Things are going to get worse. I'll skip through this. Loss and damage. COP27 is going to be a loss and damage COP. I've just come from Edinburgh, meeting with the Scottish Government. They organised a loss and damage conference. They're interested in promoting this idea of loss and damage. Loss and damage is unavoided impact and irreversible impact. That's the easiest way to think about it. So climate change is occurring, losses are escalating. We could have done something about this if we'd have acted in time. And this is a policy framework that the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance has just developed. And I actually drew out the first version of this with my colleagues in Nepal, in Kathmandu, about 3 weeks ago. But basically it's saying, in the language of the UNFCCC negotiations, they talk about avert, minimise and address loss and damage. And what we talk about avert, we're talking about mitigation. We're talking about, can we mitigate greenhouse? We can mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. We haven't done enough to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, which has led to global warming. So there's this mitigation gap. Now, the negotiations for the first 10 years were focused solely on mitigation. This idea of adaptation, adapting to the impacts of climate change, sort of arose around the year 2000. But sadly, we've had 20 years to act, but again, we haven't acted. We have an adaptation gap, and the UNEP report each year on the adaptation gap. So the mitigation gap, the adaptation gap, has resulted in this reality of loss and damage. Loss and damage, and we can transfer the residual risk, social protection, insurance products, as I've just demonstrated from Nepal. But what we're finding is this is where it's ending up. It's ending up as residual risk that those communities are ending up having to pay for. And there was a very interesting study by IIED in Bangladesh looking at coastal communities from climate disasters and the attribution of climate change to flood impact that indicated about 2 billion was the total costs. Over 1 billion of it was being paid for by those communities themselves. Couple of 100 million from the international community and about 600 or 700 million from the government of Bangladesh. But overwhelmingly, more than half of the costs were actually being borne by these communities on the front lines. So one of the issues at COP27 will be highlighting the missing piece of the climate negotiations. So, to end, I started off with the archer aiming for increasing resilience and maybe decreasing well-being, maybe increasing well-being, maybe not achieving resilience. And one of the ideas was, well, maybe we need to increase well-being. Maybe we need to target increasing well-being, and as a result, we will get benefits in terms of increasing resilience. And yeah, I'd just like to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Colin, for a great start to the day. We're very happy to take questions from our online audience, but we'll start with any questions in the room. And you wait for the microphone, please, so the online audience can hear.
Colin, my name is Kate Cochrane and I'm Head of Resilience for NHS Ireland. And I loved your final slide. I have a personal hobby which is collecting definitions of resilience. I'm now up to 378. All of them say things that are slightly different and slightly challenging. For me, resilience is most definitely purple. We understand what it is and we all agree there's different shades. But one of the things that I've been exploring with the Commonwealth Parliamentarians Association is around how we use indicators of well-being as the proxy for resilience. Because we can't measure resilience, but we can measure well-being. And well-being gives us some really interesting conversations around what is before, what is during, and what is after, so that when we start to think about mapping those impacts, we've got some tangible data to work with. From an insurance perspective, and I recognise that I know that I don't understand insurance. That's why I'm sat next to Julian, because he absolutely does. From an insurance perspective, is there a way that the well-being indicators can be brought into that insurance milieu, so we're not just looking at what happens if, whoops, there goes the bridge, but what we start to be able to reflect, actually Mrs. Cannybody can no longer get to live her life in her ordinary ways because that bridge isn't there, and that impacts on her wellness. And maybe that gives us a different type of metric that we can use to consider what the after-disaster space looks like.
Thank you. Really interesting question. On the resilience, yes, Rockefeller a few years ago organised a resilience community of practice, and they collected not only definitions of resilience but also frameworks, resilience frameworks. And I remember it was about 3 folders full of just different metrics. And Salim Ul-Haq from Bangladesh, I remember at the conference, he sort of said, well, what are you going to do with those? And they said, well, they're probably going to get recycled. He said, no, I'm taking them with me. I'm taking them back to Bangladesh where we need these good ideas. So yes, definitely resilience is different things to different people. And I think well-being is a good way to think about delivering resilience outcomes. I think on the insurance, I guess I would say the well-being indicators would be outcomes of an effective insurance program. Those farmers, I mean, we're at the point now where we can go back to those farmers and capture the outcomes for them. One of the interesting things, and one of the things that came up in the Scottish conference, is when we think about loss and damage, we don't think enough about the psychological consequences of loss and damage. And it was really, really prevalent in many of the communities I visited that they know it's the monsoon season, they know floods can happen, but the sun's shining and the river's low, but it can change overnight. And a number of people, particularly mothers, who worry about their families overnight. When they're at school or during the day, they're less concerned, but overnight there's a real worry. And I think equally, at the Scottish conference, there was a presentation from Malawi where farmers were worried about making the right decisions about the crops, because if they made the wrong decision, they would go hungry. And therefore, they wouldn't be able to feed their family. It led to abuse by husbands and family members because they were not being fed. So I think if the insurance product gives the security that the flood happens, they don't lose their crop, they just have to focus on their survival, will they have a better outcome? And I think that's something that we're very keen to document, because we want to use that to then work with the farmers who maybe didn't buy the products this year to say, well, look, this is what benefits you would get, because we know the premium subsidy is not going to last forever, and it's going to be dependent on creating a self-sustaining insurance environment, so a mutual type of product. But Julian is the expert, as you said, so thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Question for Bruce.
Thanks, Colin. So I've been doing work with practical action actually in India on early warning for landslides, and one of the things I was curious about was the information flows for the hardcore flood mitigation measures that would be put in. which is where do they kind of get their advice from, their knowledge? Is that something you've sort of been looking into, where that information flow is, how they come to the decisions on what to build where?
It hasn't been a focus of our project, and a lot of it was prior to us engaging more extensively in that region. But sadly, we don't really have much clarity. You can get the project documents from the internet, and they're available in English as well as in Nepali. But trying to work out what the consultation process has been really problematic. And there was actually a master's student from Columbia University in Nepal about 6-7 years ago who looked in detail at that project, that program, and how it failed to consult with local communities or even local government. I guess the one complicating factor is Nepal has gone through a federalization process as a result of the becoming a republic in 2009, and as a consequence the whole local governance structure has been turned on its head, and they're struggling. They're only just starting to put in place the structures needed to deliver administration at the local level. So you'd have some sort of consultative process with local communities when you implement those types of schemes. But sadly, no, this is something that we haven't really looked at, and would be a great idea for a master's student maybe.
One last question maybe, if there is one.
I raised the microphone.
Yes.
So the Canali is a very dynamic environment. So I wonder how dynamic is the parametric model for the insurance product?
Good question. This is the first year. As I said, the discussions to come up with the payments was it was backwards and forwards, because there was a total disagreement about what the purpose of the product was, whether it was to generate profit or whether it was to protect communities who face flood risk. And we sort of met somewhere in between. I would hope that looking at the impact of the floods this year, the actual total costs and the implications that has on the local economy, we should feed that into the product design for next year. So yes, the more payouts, the more experience, the better the product hopefully will become. But yes, so yeah, it is going to be hopefully going to be a dynamic process. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's perfectly on time. So thank you
you.
very much, Colin. Again, another round of applause.